The wind carried the sharp tang of diesel and freshly cut grass through the Smallville, Kansas Community Center parking lot. It was a crisp October morning in 2025, the kind where the air bit just enough to remind you winter was coming. The American flag snapped against its pole, the halyard clinking in a steady rhythm, like a metronome for the gathering crowd. A banner strung across the entrance read, "Veterans Day Ceremony, Honoring Our Heroes." The lot buzzed with families, local officials, and a high school marching band tuning their instruments, their brass notes clashing with the hum of conversation. Hank Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, his stooped frame nearly swallowed by the oversized olive-drab jacket he wore, its cuffs frayed from decades of use. At 85, his face was a map of creases, each line a silent testament to years he rarely spoke of. His hands, gnarled but steady, clutched a folded piece of paper. A letter, yellowed and brittle, dated June 10, 1944. A faded tattoo of an anchor peeked out from under his sleeve, a relic from his days as a young soldier in the 29th Infantry Division. He'd come to the ceremony every year, not for the speeches or the lukewarm coffee, but because it was the one day Smallville remembered men like him. Or so he thought. The line to enter the community center snaked past a table where a young woman in a volunteer vest checked names off a clipboard. Hank shuffled forward, his worn boots scuffing the asphalt. When his turn came, he cleared his throat, his voice low but clear. "Henry Miller," he said, adjusting his baseball cap, embroidered with D-Day veteran. The volunteer, barely out of her teens, scanned her list, her brow furrowing. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't see your name here. This events invite only veterans and their families. Do you have an invitation?" Hank's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm, almost resigned. "Don't need one," he said softly. "Been comin' here since 46. He patted the letter in his pocket as if it could vouch for him. The volunteer hesitated, glancing at the growing line behind him. "I'm really sorry, but I can't let you in without a registration. Maybe you can check with the organizer?" She pointed toward a man in a suit, barking orders near the entrance. Hank nodded, stepping aside. He felt the eyes of others in line, some curious, some impatient. A young man in a pressed ROTC uniform muttered, "Old guys holding things up." A mother shushed her child, who was pointing at Hank's jacket. The weight of their stares pressed against him, not unlike the chaos of that beach in Normandy, where he'd once been invisible under a hail of bullets. He turned away, his boots heavy on the pavement, and headed toward a bench near the flagpole. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than ever. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The air reeked of salt and cordite, the sky a gray shroud torn by the scream of artillery. Hank, barely 19, crouched behind a hedgehog obstacle, his M1 Garand slick with seawater and blood. His squad leader, Sergeant Joseph "Joe" Ryan, barked orders over the din. "Miller, you're with me. We've got a message for HQ, move." The objective was simple: deliver a coded order to the command post half a mile inland. Failure meant a stalled advance, lives lost. Hank ran, his heart pounding louder than the shells exploding around him. Joe didn't make it past the first dune. Back in Smallville, Hank sat on the bench, the cold metal biting through his thin trousers. He unfolded the letter, its creases threatening to tear. It was from Joe's sister, Mary, written days after D-Day, thanking Hank for trying to save her brother. "You carried his last order," she'd written. "You gave us hope." Hank hadn't read it in years, but he carried it always, a reminder of the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. He traced the ink with a trembling finger, lost in thought. Across the parking lot, Rebecca Becky Sullivan, 16 and brimming with the restless energy of youth, adjusted her backpack. She was late for the ceremony, her history teacher's voice echoing in her head. "Find a veteran. Tell their story. Make it personal." Becky had chosen her grandfather, Hank, not because he was family, but because she'd seen the way his eyes clouded when the 4th of July fireworks mimicked mortars. She'd begged him to come today, promising to record his story for her school project. Now, spotting him alone on the bench, she frowned. "Grandpa, why aren't you inside?" Hank folded the letter quickly, tucking it away. "They don't need an old man taking up space," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Go on, Becky. Get your story." Becky's eyes narrowed. She'd inherited her grandfather's stubborn streak. "No way. You're the story." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the entrance. "Come on, we're fixing this." At the table, the volunteer repeated her apology, but Becky wasn't having it. "He's a D-Day veteran," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "He landed on Omaha Beach. You're telling me he needs an invitation?" A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs fading. The organizer, a portly man named Tom Grayson, approached, his clipboard clutched like a shield. "What's the issue here?" he asked, his tone clipped. Becky pointed at Hank. "This is my grandfather, Henry Miller. He fought in World War II. He deserves to be here." Tom glanced at Hank, then back at his clipboard. "I'm sorry, but we have a strict guest list. We can't just." Strict guest list. A new voice cut through, sharp and commanding. It belonged to a woman in a crisp Air Force uniform, her captain's bars glinting in the morning sun. Captain Laura Bennett, stationed at nearby Fort Riley, had been invited as a guest speaker. She'd been watching from a distance, her gaze drawn to Hank's anchor tattoo and the quiet dignity in his posture. "This man's a veteran. What's the problem?" Tom stammered. "It's just protocol, ma'am." Protocol?" Laura's voice softened, but her eyes were steel. She stepped closer to Hank, her boots clicking on the asphalt. "Sir, may I ask your name and service?" Hank met her gaze, his own eyes steady despite the years. "Henry Miller, 29th Infantry, Normandy, 44. Laura's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition. She straightened and, without hesitation, snapped a salute. "Staff Sergeant Miller, it's an honor." The crowd fell silent. The volunteers' cheeks reddened. Tom's clipboard lowered. Becky's eyes widened, her phone already out, recording. Hank, caught off guard, returned a slow, precise salute, his hand trembling not from age but from the weight of memory. For a moment, it was 1944 again, and he was standing on that beach carrying Joe's last order. June 6, 1944, Normandy. Hank stumbled through the sand, the message tucked inside his jacket. Bullets whizzed past, one grazing his helmet. Joe was gone, his body slumped behind a dune, but his voice echoed in Hank's mind. "Get it to HQ, Miller. Don't stop." He ran, dodging craters, until he reached the command post, collapsing as he handed the blood-stained paper to a colonel. That order saved a platoon pinned down by German fire. Hank never knew their names, only that they lived because he ran. Captain Bennett turned to the crowd, her voice carrying over the parking lot. "This man stormed Omaha Beach. He carried orders that saved lives. And you're telling him he can't enter a ceremony honoring his service?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with reproach. A few people clapped tentatively, others nodded, shame creeping into their expressions. Tom cleared his throat. "Of course he's welcome. My apologies, Mr. Miller." Hank nodded, but his eyes were on Laura. "Thank you, Captain," he said quietly. He didn't move toward the entrance, though. Instead, he glanced at the flagpole where the stars and stripes fluttered. "I just came to hear the names," he said almost to himself. "The ones who didn't come back." Becky tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa, let's go in. You belong there." Laura stepped closer, her voice low. "Sergeant, I'd like you to sit with me. Front row. Your story needs to be heard." Hank hesitated, the letter burning in his pocket. He hadn't told his story in years, not to Becky, not to anyone. The weight of Joe's death, the faces of his squad, the screams of that day, they were his to carry, not to share. But Laura's salute, Becky's insistence, the quiet respect in the eyes of strangers, it stirred something in him, a spark he thought had died decades ago. As they walked toward the entrance, the crowd parted, some offering nods, others whispering thanks. The band struck up "Sweet Caroline," a Smallville tradition, and the notes mingled with the clink of the flagpole. Hank's steps were slow but steady, each one a bridge between 1944 and now. Inside, the ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance, the crowd's voices rising in unison. Hank stood, hand over heart, his eyes fixed on the flag. Becky leaned close, whispering, "You're gonna tell me everything, right?" He gave her a small smile, the first she'd seen all day. But as the mayor took the podium, droning on about sacrifice and heroes, a man in the back row stood, holding a photograph. He was old, nearly as old as Hank, his hands shaking as he approached the stage. The room stilled. "Henry Miller," the man said, his voice cracking. "You here?" Hank froze, his heart thudding. The man held up the photograph, a grainy black and white image of young soldiers, Hank among them. "You saved my brother," the man said. "And I've been looking for you for 80 years. To be continued? What happens next? Who is this man, and what does the photograph reveal about Hank's past? How will this moment change Smallville and Hank himself? Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to find out in Part 2, and join us in honoring the quiet heroes among us. What have you noticed today? The Smallville Community Center smelled of polished wood and weak coffee, the kind served in styrofoam cups that burned your fingers. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a warm glow over rows of folding chairs filled with townsfolk, veterans and school kids clutching notepads. The American flag stood sentinel at the front, its stars crisp against a field of blue, swaying slightly as the heater kicked on. Hank Miller sat in the front row, his granddaughter Becky at his side, her phone still recording. His hands rested on his knees, the folded letter from 1944 tucked safely in his pocket. Captain Laura Bennett sat to his right, her Air Force uniform a stark contrast to his faded jacket. The room buzzed with anticipation, all eyes on the old man who'd interrupted the mayor's speech. The man, frail but determined, stood at the podium, clutching the photograph. His name was Walter Walt Peterson, 83, his face weathered like Hank's, his eyes bright with a mix of grief and purpose. "Henry Miller," he repeated, his voice steadier now. "You saved my brother Tommy. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach." He held up the photograph, a grainy image of 6 young soldiers, arms slung around each other, grinning before the invasion. Hank was second from the left, his face boyish, unscarred. Next to him was Joe Ryan, his squad leader. And at the edge, Tommy Peterson, Walter's older brother, barely 20. Hank's breath caught. He hadn't seen that photo in decades, hadn't known it existed. The room seemed to shrink, the chatter fading to a dull roar, like the distant crash of waves on that blood-soaked beach. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Walt. June 6, 1944, Normandy. Hank's boots sank into the sand, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the dunes. The message in his jacket, a coded order for artillery support, was all that mattered. Joe Ryan had fallen, his last words a hoarse command, "Get it to HQ, Miller." German machine guns chattered, pinning down a platoon to the east. Hank didn't know their names, only that they were Americans trapped in a kill zone. He dodged a crater, his helmet grazed by a bullet, and reached the command post, shoving the paper into a colonel's hands. Minutes later, artillery roared, silencing the German guns. The pinned platoon broke free. Tommy Peterson, a rifleman in that unit, lived because of it. Walt's voice trembled as he spoke. "Tommy came home because of you, Hank. He told me about the kid who ran through hell to deliver that order. Said you were the bravest man he'd ever seen." He paused, swallowing hard. "He carried this picture till the day he died in '85. Told me to find you to say thank you. I've been looking ever since." The room was silent, save for the soft creak of chairs and a child's cough. Becky's hand found Hank's, her fingers tight. Hank stared at the photograph, his throat tight. He'd carried Joe's death like a stone, blaming himself for not pulling him to safety. He'd never known about Tommy, never known the ripple of his actions. The letter in his pocket from Joe's sister had been his only tether to that day, a reminder of loss. Now Walt's words offered something else, absolution. Captain Bennett stood, her voice clear. "Sergeant Miller, on behalf of every soldier here, I thank you. Your courage on Omaha Beach saved lives, including Private Thomas Peterson's." She turned to the crowd. "This is why we gather, not just to remember but to honor the living, those who carry the weight of our freedom." The crowd erupted in applause, not the polite kind but a thunderous wave that shook the room. Veterans stood, some saluting, others wiping their eyes. The ROTC cadet who'd muttered earlier now clapped hardest, his face red with shame. The volunteer at the entrance, still clutching her clipboard, joined in, her earlier mistake forgotten in the swell of respect. Becky leaned close, whispering, "Grandpa, you're a hero." Hank shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I just did my job, kid." But his eyes were wet, and for the first time in years he didn't look away from the flag. Walt stepped down from the podium, the photograph in hand. He approached Hank, his steps slow but deliberate. "This belongs to you," he said, pressing the picture into Hank's hands. Their fingers brushed, 2 old men bound by a moment 80 years past. Hank looked at the faces, Joe, Tommy, himself, and saw not just loss but brotherhood. The mayor, recovering from his interrupted speech, took the podium again. "Folks, I think we've all been reminded today what Veterans Day is about. I propose we dedicate this year's ceremony to Sergeant Henry Miller and the men of the 29th Infantry. And I'd like to invite Hank to say a few words." Hank froze. Public speaking wasn't his way. He'd spent decades dodging attention, letting his medals gather dust in a drawer. But Becky nudged him, her eyes fierce with pride, and Laura gave him a nod. Slowly he stood, the photograph still in his hand. The crowd hushed, waiting. "I ain't much for speeches," Hank began, his voice rough but steady. "I was just a kid back then, scared like everyone else. We lost a lot of good men, my friend Joe Ryan among them. I carried his last order, and I've carried him with me ever since. He held up the photograph, his hand steady now. This picture, it's them. The ones who didn't come back. And the ones who did, like Tommy. If you want to honor us, don't just clap. Remember their names. Teach them to your kids. That's all I got. He sat down, the room exploding in applause again. Becky hugged him, her face buried in his shoulder. Walt sat beside them, silent but smiling, his mission complete after 80 years. Later that day, the ceremony ended with the band playing Taps, the mournful notes drifting over the parking lot as the crowd dispersed. Hank and Becky stayed behind, standing by the flagpole where the day had begun. The air was colder now, the sun dipping low, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson. A small group gathered nearby, Laura, Walt, and a few veterans, sharing quiet stories of their own. Becky held up her phone, showing Hank the video she'd recorded. This is going viral, Grandpa. Everyone's gonna know your story. Hank chuckled, a rare sound. Long as they know Joe's name too. Laura approached, holding a small pin, a replica of the 29th Infantry's insignia. This is from my unit, she said. We'd be honored if you'd wear it. Hank took it, his fingers tracing the familiar crest. He pinned it to his jacket, next to the anchor tattoo he'd never covered. The next week, Smallville's town council voted to rename the community center's flagpole the Miller Ryan Memorial, a nod to Hank and Joe. A brass plaque was planned to be unveiled next Veterans Day, inscribed with the names of local soldiers who served in Normandy. Becky's school project, now a 20-minute video, was shown at assemblies across the county, sparking a new tradition. Students interviewing veterans, preserving their stories before they faded. Hank didn't change much. He still drank his coffee black, still walked to the memorial every June 6th to lay a single poppy. But his steps were lighter now, his shoulders less bowed. The photograph sat on his mantle, next to Joe's letter, a quiet reminder that his orders, his last and greatest, had been fulfilled. In Smallville, the flag still flies, the halyard clinking in the wind. Every Veterans Day, a new name is read aloud, a story told. And in every crowd there's someone like Hank, quiet, unnoticed, carrying a past heavier than their years. A salute, a kind word, a moment of recognition. These are the orders we can all carry. Who's the hero in your town? Notice them. Honor them. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to keep their legacies alive.